Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. The U.S. completed another round of strikes against Iran late Monday, according to U.S. Central Command, just hours after President Donald Trump warned that Tehran would pay for the deaths of 3 American service members. As the conflict widens across the Gulf and concerns grow over energy security and global shipping, we're now joined by Professor Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at University College Dublin. Good to have you back with us. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Sascha.
So we're looking at this now, and how we see it is 10 consecutive days of more strikes by the United States. Also now the Iranians striking targets across the region, Bahrain, other allies there. So with this, also the president of Iran saying this is now a regional war. Is there an off-ramp? Is this going to escalate? Where are we right now?
Well, Sascha, of course there's an off-ramp. I mean, there's always the question of whether both sides will take a step back from these attacks, which are taking place in the Strait of Hormuz, inside Iran and across the region. But this is the longest set of strikes that we've had from both sides since the ceasefire was declared on April the 7th. And I think it is fair to say now that there is no longer a ceasefire. You get back to the fundamental, which is Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz, that waterway through which about 20 to 25% of the world's maritime oil and gas passes, as well as other commodities. The United States does not want to allow Iran to control the Strait of Hormuz, even though the Memorandum of Understanding, which the U.S. signed, points towards that. So what do you do to prevent that? Well, the Americans were encouraging shipping to go alongside a route alongside the Omani coast, bypassing Iranian control. The Iranians fired on vessels that were doing that. Then the Americans strike Iranian targets. Then the Iranians retaliate on American positions in Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, even in the UAE and Qatar in the past 10 days. And this cycle is just slowly ratcheting up. And I think what's most concerning is that while both sides said that messages are being passed, they're still being passed through the mediators, there is no sign at this point that the indirect talks are going to resume.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you also mentioned in terms of commodities and how vital still, I mean, the Strait of Hormuz is to oil, to global shipping. Now that we have, though, tankers that are directly targeted at being hit, does that change the dynamics here at all? Will this maybe have other countries in the Gulf respond finally, or will we have more of an international reaction, or will this just slowly, let's say, just continue as it is?
Well, the Iranians were already, the Gulf states were already responding, but they're responding in different ways. So, for example, the UAE, although in a small way, was actually joining in military operations before the ceasefire occurred. Now, will they do so now? They're certainly moving closer towards Israel and the United States, but at the same time, according to people I've talked to, the UAE had paid Iran $3 billion, whether that was directly or through the unfreezing of assets, so that the attacks would stop on them. Then you have states like Qatar that are trying to step up the mediation efforts to try to avoid conflict. And then you have Saudi Arabia in a way sort of playing both sides. The Saudis are very, very upset with the Trump administration for getting them into this mess. On the one hand, they are backing the Pakistani mediators. On the other hand, they have been telling the Trump folks, look, if you're going to attack Iran, if we're going to go through this, in effect, finish the job. Either curb the regime where it surrenders or where, in fact, it falls.
And also, I mean, we talk a lot about the Strait of Hormuz. Let's go on the other side. Let's go from the Persian Gulf over to the Red Sea. We've had new threats now by the Houthi rebels who've said basically they're going to embargo Saudi Arabia with a maritime blockade of some sort. They've threatened action here. I mean, this would lead then to problems to the Suez Canal. So how much of, let's say, a spillover effect and a threat is this new statement here by the Houthis?
About an additional 12% of the world's maritime trade goes through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which you're showing on the screen. And during the Israel war on Gaza from 2023, the shipping was down up to 80% at times because of Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. Now, we have to emphasize, the Houthis have just simply made a statement. They haven't begun attacking shipping. They haven't begun to close the strait. It's a rhetorical warning shot to the Saudis, which is if you continue to blockade our airspace, then we will do this. The Houthis have been cautious up to this point. They did lose quite a few of their leaders when Israel carried out targeted assassinations during that war in Gaza. So I'm not sure they'll carry through the threat, but if they do, in addition to the continuing problems in the Strait of Hormuz, this would be a significant shock to the global economy.
Mm-hmm. And also the global economy you just mentioned there. We're looking at oil prices. I mean, they have oscillated a lot over these past months, but just as these strikes have occurred, if we compare from yesterday, from Monday into Tuesday, actually now oil prices have sort of stabilized, but a little bit down. I mean, it's early days, but nevertheless, is that a good indicator for us at all, or is some analysts are warning this may shoot up again over $100 a barrel, or where do you see this going?
In a way, the oil and gas markets have sort of priced in the current limbo that we're in. So, back in March, when we had all out war, the price was around $110 a barrel, almost reached $120 a barrel at one point. Then when we thought there'd be, might be a lasting ceasefire last month, the price drops down to just over $70 per barrel. As I speak to you right now, it's around 88. And I think it will remain in that range if we're in this limbo. But of course, if we get a further shock, so let's say the Americans expand their attacks in Iran, let's say the Iranians further expand their attacks in retaliation, or let's say the Houthis do close off the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, then I think you see that rise back to the $100 mark and possibly even higher. What you have is stable instability at this point, if that makes sense.
And also, I think there are various reasons, but I think it seems one of those main reasons why America is now, and President Trump has ordered these strikes, is he wants to conclude this. I mean, we've had violations of this so-called ceasefire, but also at the same time, we've had now these deaths of these 3 U.S. servicemen. I think since about the summertime, I think early July, we have about 100 servicemen injured, generally U.S. servicemen injured. How significant is that? How much does that push the president in any sort of direction?
I think rhetorically it stiffens the Trump administration to say, yeah, we're going to continue these attacks on Iran. We'll expand them. But at this point, I think you've had 17 American servicemen who've been killed since February 28th. I don't want to minimize that, but it's a relatively small number compared to the thousands who've died across the region. And I'm not sure that if those numbers remain that low, that Americans will consider that as it were the priority marker of where they stand. 2/3 of them already oppose the war. I have a slightly different reading than you do. I think the reason why we're back in this limbo is not because Trump wants a deal. I think Trump and his inner circle backed out of the deal that they could have had. Remember, it was Donald Trump who, without notifying his advisors, who last month signed that memorandum of understanding. The problem for him and his inner circle is that when he did so, he committed himself to Iranian terms, not only Iranian management of the Strait of Hormuz, but that in return for opening it up to shipping, Iran would get many billions of dollars, in fact, hundreds of billions of dollars potentially, through the lifting of sanctions, the unfreezing of assets, and a private investment and reconstruction fund. Meanwhile, Iran's nuclear issue, which supposedly was a concern for the Trump folks, would be relegated. It would be in a later stage of negotiations. I think Trump signed that document. Then his people looked at what they'd committed to, including that Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz, and they've been trying to undo it ever since.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think at the same time, I mean, it's hard at this point to say, let's say, who is winning in this regard. I mean, this word comes up too many times in the wrong way. But can you just tell us, in your case, where we are right now? Also, I mean, what we make of the warnings. I mean, I think the U.S. State Department has warned Americans. I think an alert has gone out to Americans around the world to be careful. I mean, does that show us anything? And who is, let's say, where is the pendulum right now, if we can call it that, in terms of who is pointing the most from the current conflict right now?
Nobody's winning, but they're in different positions. And that is that the Iranian regime has survived, despite the efforts of not only the U.S., but the Israelis to change it, including through the assassination of its leaders back on February 28th. But while the regime survives, Iran has been heavily damaged, more than $300 billion of damage. And the regime still faces an issue of legitimacy if we ever get a lasting ceasefire. The United States has failed in a war to try to show its dominance of the region. Now it is reduced to telling its citizens, maybe you'll have to get out. And its Navy is ineffective. It is not effective in breaking that Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz, which was open before the war. So the U.S. has gotten nothing out of this. Indeed, it's in a worse political position than it was in talks just before the war. And the Gulf states are in a worse position. Not only are they taking damage from Iranian attacks, but their security relationship with the United States, which has been fundamental for decades, has now been shaken. How much it has been bent and even possibly broken, well, we remain to see that.
And just one quick last comment. I mean, I'm just reminded of that NATO declaration back in Ankara, where actually in one of the last paragraphs, it mentions very much about how the alliance is committed to, let's say, being somehow involved to protecting shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Now that that's happened, do you see this at all in any way involving NATO more than it did in the past? Just quickly before we close.
The countries who are in NATO, and we're talking about the UK and the French leading discussions, but also others, as well as countries from the international community, have said, look, we will put warships, we will put other ships into the strait to demine it, to help open it up when there's a lasting ceasefire. But they've also said, we can't put our ships into a war zone while there's active hostilities going on. That's a sensible position. Donald Trump rails against it, says he's been betrayed, but the fundamental is that the Trump administration got itself into war, did not predict the Strait of Hormuz would be closed, which was an almost fatal miscalculation, and now they're looking for other countries to bail them out, and those countries are saying, let's get the ceasefire and some measure of stability, and then we'll proceed to do that.
All right, well, giving us the latest there from a very complicated situation. Always a pleasure. Scott Lucas, thanks for your time today.
Thanks to you and your great viewers.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for more. Goodbye.